Welcome everyone. As Lori mentioned, my name is Weston Rose. I work in the Office of Graduate Studies and I'm the Media and Communications Specialist there. I do a lot of different things, but one of the main things I do is technical writing. So I write about really specific situations related to either business or science. I do have a confession to make. I'm not a scientist. So what I did to sort of create this workshop was I read a lot. I read about 15 books, and here are some of the main ones that I looked at, and I'll talk about those throughout the course of the presentation. But I read those, I kind of condensed those, I used my background in technical writing, and then I ran this whole presentation, which is about 41 slides, past several of the scientists in the College of Science, including Dr. Ann Galliard from biology, Dr. Donovan Haynes from chemistry, and a few other people. So hopefully you get some benefit out of it. As you look in your folders, you'll notice this one, 70 useful sentences for academic writing. This is something that you may find useful later. It's really just, you plug in your information as it goes and it makes your writing sound more academic. You'll also find a calendar, a daily calendar for managing a project like writing a thesis or a dissertation or a scholarly article and how you can fill that out. And I'll talk about this as we go through. But first, let's talk about the types of documents that you'll be creating as a graduate student and then hopefully later as a professor. So graduate students create lab reports, you write theses or dissertations, you create presentations, whether that's a PowerPoint or maybe it's a poster presentation, and also you collaborate on scholarly articles or maybe you write your own. Of course, professors do more of the same. They have some slightly different documents. They write grant proposals. Maybe you'll be in on a little bit of that. They write letters of recommendation. And what we see is that with each document, the criteria are obviously going to change because they require different things from you. Some other types of writing I just thought I'd bring up would be if you decide to take your career in a different direction, maybe you don't want to stay in academia, you might go into business or industry, and then you'll be writing progress reports, maybe you'll be writing sales or marketing material, and again, those requirements on you as a writer will be very, very different. And it's even possible that you'll end up writing some popular science books or articles like I'm thinking of Stiff by Mary Roach, which is about like research on cadavers. We have the staff's facility here, which we do a lot of that. I'm thinking about, what's that book about the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, which was about DNA, right, and how it was used again and again. So that's popular science, and actually popular science as a genre has become very popular in recent years. Some hallmarks of science writing would be well, the motive is a little bit different. When we talk about motives, when you write, you might write a novel, like a fantasy novel like Harry Potter, and that's obviously entertainment, right? But in science writing, we're not entertaining, we're informing people, which changes the tone. We're more factual, we're less emotional, we're just very neutral about things. But you don't just have one mode. A lot of time, or motive, you often have several motives. They're a layer, right? Kind of a hierarchy. And so a secondary motive might be to persuade the reader. If you write a grant proposal, obviously you're trying to persuade your reader to give you money, right? If you're writing about your findings on a controversial subject, you're trying to persuade your reader to accept your hypothesis. So you will try to persuade, and that will kind of require a slightly different tone, which is self-assured, confident, rather than doubtful, etc. The style is a little bit different too. You aim to be very brief, so you don't have flowery language like you might in the humanities. I come from the English department. I got my master's degree in English, and so there it's all about making the writing sound really good, about being very articulate. And it's not that that's not an aim here, it's just that it's more clipped and more factual, right? And you probably are aware of a lot of these things. The tone, again, is objective, and you're informing without emotion and without editorializing. What does it mean to editorialize, by the way? If you editorialize, you have opinions, right? Like you might write a letter to the editor in the newspaper and you're stating your opinion on something, right? So you're not really letting your opinion slip in. Some writing tips, I'll gloss over these because again the PowerPoint slide is really long, and I will provide you with this slide later on. We'll put it on our website. I can email it to you. Hopefully you'll find it beneficial. But some things that I did want to highlight were, let's say, passive voice. When we talk about passive voice, this is really like the difference between an active voice is the dog ate the bone, right? So the dog is the subject, the verb is ate, the bone is what was eaten, right? But in a passive voice is the bone was eaten, right? So the subject of the sentence becomes what was eaten and not who was doing the eating, right? So passive voice is actually used much more frequently in scientific writing because the emphasis is really on the study and not on the scholar who's actually doing it. This is really different than in the humanities. And this is even reflected in the way that you cite your sources, because in MLA, which is the style guide that you use in the English, in the field of English, you write out the whole person's name who wrote a book. So you might refer to Harold Bloom, who's a critic, a really famous literary critic, and you would write out Bloom, Harold, and whatever book he wrote. But in APA and other scientific journals, you don't really include the person's first name, do you? You just include the initial. Because honestly, it doesn't matter who did the study is what matters. So the focus is on that, and that's why the focus is on passive voice. This doesn't mean that active voice is totally eliminated, but it's just that passive voice is used, or that active voice is totally eliminated. It's just that passive voice is much more common, and if you do use active voice, you always use we, even if you're the only author in the study. So we found that blah, blah, blah. That's just a convention. Another thing I thought I'd bring up really quickly were stats and figures. Some of the faculty mentioned that students oftentimes say that something is significantly better or higher or faster without backing it up with statistics, and that's just not really possible for you to do. So make sure that if you're going to make a statement that you have something to back it up with. Let's see, what else? I talked a little bit about active voice. I just thought that I would go in a little bit more deeply. So here, active voice, I peeled and homogenized the potatoes. In passive voice, the potatoes, which was the object of the original sentence, becomes the subject, right? Were peeled is the whole verb phrase, and you can actually completely omit who did it. You could say the potatoes were peeled and homogenized by me, but you don't have to. That prepositional phrase, by me, becomes completely optional. And actually, a funny thing, if you notice the way that politicians speak, a lot of times they'll say mistakes were made. Now what they're doing is something very subtle and very clever. They're leaving out who made the mistake. And so what they can do is acknowledge that something's problematic because they can't be quiet about it, or otherwise there will be an uproar, but they also don't have to accept the blame. So it's just a very subtle thing that you'll notice if you pay attention. Another thing I thought, I read this actually on Facebook, was that you can often recognize passive voice if you can add by zombies to it. So if you think about it, the potatoes were peeled and homogenized by zombies, right? So that's an easy way to recognize it. It's not 100% fail-proof, but it will help you a lot of the times. So again, passive voice is oftentimes preferred, especially when we talk about abstract register, which I'll get into in a minute, but it's definitely used in the academy. Here's an example. I don't want to go into this too much. This is something that you can do later on your own when you get this PowerPoint, but you can actually go through and do some of these exercises. And I highly recommend you reading this book called Writing Science in Plain English by Anne Green. She has a lot of great exercises on different topics in science, and she really urges people to write in this plain, clear way that I really took to, and I got all these books out of the library, by the way, so you can too. Let's see. Let's talk about some specific uses of tense. When we talk about tense in terms of grammar, what does that refer to? Past, present, future. We're referring to time, right? Yeah, exactly. Now, something that you might just be interested in is that there's technically no future tense in the English language. We refer to future tense, but there really isn't one. There is one in Spanish, and you can tell when there's a tense because the verb will actually change, right? But if you think about it in English, in the future you can say, I will work tomorrow, or you can just say, tomorrow I work. So there's really no tense. We use a circumlocution to get around it. So really we only have present tense and past tense. And in terms of science, these have very specific connotations. So present tense, you use that to make general statements that the scientific community agrees are valid. These are, explanations of phenomena that have based on experimental results that many scientists have replicated again and again. That's when you would use present tense. Past tense is used a little bit differently. It's used to limit the interpretations and conclusions of your own work. It's used mainly in the materials and methods section that I'll talk about in a minute, also results. Whereas if you look at present tense, that's mainly used in the introduction and the discussion of a thesis or dissertation. And then also about past tense, whenever you're describing a work that you've personally carried out, that's when you would use past tense. Again, this is really specific to the academy and to like a thesis or dissertation. If maybe some of you are here because you're interested in becoming more marketable in terms of business or in terms of, writing and media, so this might not apply necessarily to that, but later on I'll talk about some stuff that will. About the format of a scientific paper, you guys probably already know this, but they call it IMRD format. That stands for these items in red, so the introduction, the materials and methods, the results and the discussion, which are sort of the heart of your thesis or dissertation. So of course you'll have a title that's going to be short, informative, descriptive. It's about the essence of the paper. You'll have a list of authors, and so that's anyone who played an active role, whether it was in the experiment or in the actual writing. An abstract, typically these are 250 words or less. And generally when you're doing research, and again you probably know this, but you'll read the abstract to get an idea if you want to read the whole work. You don't want to spend 150 pages reading some article that you can't use ultimately. So they're really a quick way of understanding what's going on with this thesis, dissertation, or article. In the introduction, let's move on. In the introduction, you'll concisely state what motivated this study and how it fits into the existing body of knowledge and the objectives at work. Primarily, it consists of two things. That's the background or historical perspective on the topic. That makes sense in the introduction, right? And also the statement of all the objectives at work. In the materials and methods, this is where you're going to be really thorough. You're going to describe how the experiment was done, essentially, and what you used. Some things I'd like to highlight here would be, let's see, when and where the work was carried out. If it was carried out in nature, in the field, then you'll want to mention that. But if it's carried out in a lab, you won't. Dr. Sherry Hughes-Stamm from Forensic Science mentioned that it was a good idea for students to mention the sample numbers, statistical methods, and programs used, the IRB process in this point. And she also said you can refer to previously published work, that's the original work, if you're using the same exact method. So you might say something like, this study was performed as per Great et al., etc., right? Let's see, what else? So basically you just go into a lot of detail in the material and methods section. Now, when we talk about the results and discussion section of an IMRD formatted paper, this is where people's views on it diverge. So I started off from this point, a student handbook for writing in biology by Karen Neasley. Maybe you're familiar with it, but this is really aimed at biology. So in terms of writing a thesis for biology, the results section and the thesis and the discussion section are very separated. But in a field like chemistry, that's not necessarily the case. So in the results, generally, you'll say where findings of the experiment are summarized without giving any explanation to their significance. You just present it as is. Now, this isn't true of all fields, like I said. The hard line between results and discussion doesn't exist in every field. In some fields, you'll have to give an explanation of what was required before moving on to the next experiment, or the reader will be unable to understand how one experiment led to the next one. And even in the results, the article or thesis needs to tell a story. That's what you're essentially doing. You're telling a story. And the level of interpretation is required. So in the discussion, again, in biology, this is different from the results, so this would be where you would be doing the interpreting. But anyway, you would give possible explanations, and also the author may summarize the results and the way that supports the conclusions, describe the results and how they relate to the existing body of knowledge, etc. One thing that a lot of the faculty in the College of Science wanted me to touch on was citing sources. And partly this has to do with Academic integrity. It's really important for you to cite your sources, because if you don't, what you're really doing is showing a lack of respect for intellectual property. It's really, really important that you cite your sources. But I thought that I'd just start with some of the ways that you'll do that. So in each field there are different guidelines, right? So in English and the humanities, they use MLA. In psychology and the soft sciences, they use APA, right? In biology, I think you guys use the Council of Science Editors. Chemistry uses something slightly different. Some general rules that you might already be aware of, but if you're not, this will be helpful. So you'll include in-text citation, where you're citing someone else's work. You'll always, at the very end, have a bibliography or a list of references. You'll include primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. So what's a primary source? A peer-reviewed journal, right? So for example, in English, I can use that as an example. If I read a book like maybe something by George R.R. Martin, right? Like I'm going to talk about Game of Thrones. So that's going to be my primary source, because that's what my paper's about. Then if anyone else has written criticism about Game of Thrones, then that would be my secondary source that I would use, right? What's a tertiary source? Actually, a tertiary source is one that is indirectly related. So for example, if I read Pride and Prejudice, that would be my primary source, and then I read criticism about Pride and Prejudice, that's my secondary. But if I look at a definition of what pride is or what prejudice is in a dictionary or even in an encyclopedia, that would be a secondary source, because it's not really a tertiary source, because it's not related directly to the material, and yet it has bearing on it. It's bad practice in general if I'm reading this book and Karen Neasley cites someone and then I just use that same quote that she used in my dissertation, but I never went back and actually read that. That's bad practice. You don't want to do that. It's tempting because it makes things easier, but the easy way is not often the right way. Let's talk a little bit about how to identify and avoid some examples of plagiarism. So plagiarism, as most of you know, is basically using someone else's ideas without acknowledging them. And in essence, it's intellectual theft. And partly this is cultural, because not every culture has a habit of intellectual things belonging to them. But in the United States, we have it is important for us to do that. It also complicates things, to be quite honest, especially in a university, because if you're a student and you do an experiment, does that information belong to you because you created it? It generally does, unless your research was funded by, say, a pharmaceutical company, and then they own it, right? How much does the university own because they provided the equipment that you use to conduct your experiments? And actually, it's something that universities and lawyers are really trying to figure out, because it's becoming ever more complex as we progress and as technology moves forward. But essentially, you don't want to steal someone else's idea without citing them, and you will be doing a lot of citing, because obviously you are building upon a whole body of knowledge, right? You're adding to it, finding gaps within it and filling those gaps. It's ethically wrong. It demonstrates a lack of respect for the academic community. It can result in failing grades, of course, increased scrutiny, and even expulsion. That's in the graduate handbook, so if you do intentionally plagiarize, they can kick you out of school. But a lot of plagiarism, honestly, isn't someone trying to get by. It's someone not understanding how to properly cite. And I understand why, because honestly, any style guide you look at, a level of interpretation is required, and not everyone agrees on it. So you just do the very best you can. You try to act within the spirit of the law, is how I would describe it. So unintentional plagiarism is failure to understand what kinds of information must be acknowledged, failure to reference the original material properly, and also failure to understand the subject matter clearly. Those things can result in what's often called patch writing, which is where you're including other people's work, their direct quotes maybe, their ideas, without properly citing them. So again, we recognize that in terms of the university, that we have to provide you with the information to help you cite things properly. And that's why we have the Writing Center, or actually now it's called the Academic Success Center. So you can go there for help with citation and also reach out to your professors. Also, I thought I'd just touch on self-plagiarism. Have you guys ever heard of that? What's self-plagiarism?
When you don't cite your previous research.
Right. So basically it's like, oh, I wrote this paper for a biology class. I'm going to take it, change the name on it, and turn it in for my chemistry class, right? So you have to actually cite yourself. And if you look at scholars, a lot of times they will cite theirself, which honestly the first time I noticed it, I was like, that's really pompous, you know, to cite yourself. But it's not. It's just general practice. Let's talk a little bit about the writing process. Probably you guys have seen this. It starts out with pre-writing. Then you have writing, and then finally you have rewriting. And you can kind of think about it like building a table or building a house, right? You're not just going to, you know, go out into the woods, grab some sticks, and like fashion a table, right? You're going to plan it out. You're going to make blueprints. You're going to estimate the cost of the lumber. You're going to acquire all of the materials before you start. You're going to cut the pieces of the wood, right? And before you actually start building it. A lot of students want to skip pre-writing, that planning stage, because it's boring and they just want to get into the heart of writing. But if you skip it, it honestly makes your work later on down the road much more hard, much more difficult, I would say, and also unnecessarily difficult. So writing is actually the building of the table, in other words, and rewriting would be polishing the table, you know, adding, you know, a finishing touch to it. They call the writing process interconnected and recursive. So it's interconnected because you can't really pry any one part apart, really. They're all necessary. And it's called recursive. Recursive means characterized by a repeated process. So you're not just going to move from pre-writing to writing to rewriting just in this seamless line, right? You're going to plan your project, you're going to start writing it, it's going to give you more ideas, you're going to go back to the drawing board. You're going to then, as you're writing it, you're going to be, oh yeah, correcting spelling with spell check, maybe adding a comma here and there, having people give you feedback. They'll give you some feedback on lower order concerns and you'll change that too. So it's all kind of going on at the same time. But if you can segment it out a little bit, it'll make your job a little easier. So I kind of define what pre-writing, writing, and rewriting are, although I do feel like you have a really good idea of what those are. I would just say that in terms of rewriting, have you guys ever heard of hawks and locks? Maybe you have. Hawks are like higher order concerns. So that's when you're revising your work. You've written a thesis, or at least significant chapters of a thesis, and you take it to a tutor. The first thing they're going to do is not check for spelling and grammar. They might look at it here and there, but they're mainly seeing, does this make sense? Are you on topic? You know, are you doing the bigger picture things like, you know, things like that. So I would say, you know, take it to your thesis chair, take it to people that you trust, you know, peers, and even to tutors too. They can help you to say, well, this is making sense to me or it's not. And also higher order concerns deal with deleting or adding large sections of text, not just sentences, but even whole chapters, maybe adding new directions or dimensions to your thesis, to your scholarly article maybe. And then lower order concerns are spelling, grammar, and mechanics. People like to think that grammar is, you know, where to put a comma, and actually that's not true at all. That's mechanics, right? Punctuation, that's refers to mechanics. And by the way, do you guys know where punctuation comes from? Where we got all that? We got it from musical notation, because there's a musical quality to your voice, and so that's where we get things like question marks and periods and all these other things. So if you know anything about music, which I don't, I can't even play the radio, so you know, but if you do, then you might notice some similarities. I did notice some great time frames in this book, and one was how to plan a lab report. It's an 8-day process, they say. And basically, one of the main things I would tell you is they break it down to the time frame, the activity, and the rationale behind the activity. So, some of it's kind of self-evident, but one thing that I did like about it was Neasley talks about giving yourself some time between actually writing the piece and then going back and revising it, which is not always possible if we haven't budgeted our time well, and that's what I'll be talking about a little in terms of planning, is how to budget your time adequately to give yourself the needed space to actually correct your document. But if you give yourself some time between writing the document and then editing it, you'll have clearer eyes. Because a lot of times I've noticed that if I write something and then I go back and read it immediately after, I'm inserting what I think I wrote, not exactly what I wrote. And that's the benefit of giving it to someone else. They're going to notice not what you wrote, but just their blank slate, right? Who reads your work. So you guys can refer back to this time frame later if you find it helpful. I would encourage you again to read this book, or at least look at some of the activities in there because they're helpful. But this is something that I thought would be really helpful if you plan on writing a thesis. I wrote my thesis in about a year and a half, but it wasn't scientific. And even though I did the IRB process with some human subjects, it wasn't that intense. I just gave a survey out, right? So you guys might be working with animals. You might be, working with human subjects in a different way that will require a much more lengthy IRB process. So some things that you need to think about are writing a thesis in science takes about 2 years. So it takes many, many months to conduct the experiment, and also you need to kind of pay attention to the IRB process. When you get this PowerPoint, you can follow this link to the IRB's webpage. I think it stands for Institutional Review Board. Have any of you ever visited their webpage? I would recommend doing it if you haven't, because there are specific times that they meet. So basically, they give you permission to conduct your experiment or not. And if you don't hit it at the right time, you could be waiting 6 weeks, 8 weeks before you're getting permission, because they meet 3 times in a long semester. So in the spring, they're going to meet in February, March, and April. And then it's going to be 6 more weeks until they meet again. They'll meet once in June, they'll meet once in July, and then in the fall, they'll meet in, September, October, and November. So you need to make sure that you have all of your ducks in a row before you go to them, because they're going to, you've created your surveys, you have a plan, they have like a little test that you take, so do all that stuff first. And then when you get into the next year, which would be like month 13, that's when you might begin your proposal class. Maybe you'll begin it before. This isn't 100% exact, so you can take the time frame and make it work for you. It's not rigid. You don't have to totally follow it. But these are just some things I would think about. Begin the proposal class in month 14. Attend a template workshop. In the Office of Graduate Studies, we've developed a template for you guys to write your theses and dissertations in. Supposedly it makes it a little bit easier for you to do that. Hopefully that's true. And so you guys might just attend it to see how it works, what's going on with this. And also continue reading and researching. Let's see, what else? Some helpful things that I might point out would be in month 17 to create a calendar. And you could do this earlier, but basically create your own deadlines is what I would say. And really what I'm talking about here is less writing and more project management. But when you write a scholarly article, or when you write a thesis or dissertation, you're managing a project. And that's a transferable skill that you can apply to anything else. And so basically, you need to make sure that you understand every facet of what you're about to do, the IRB process, the experiment itself, and how long it's going to take you to write all this. And what I would say is set deadlines for yourself, self-imposed deadlines that are 2 weeks ahead of time. So if you have to defend by March 13th, make sure that you're actually totally finished 2 weeks ahead of time, and that you're defending 2 weeks ahead of time. That way that you don't run into any problems. Some other things I would say would be to make a daily habit of when you're actually writing something. It's really hard to make yourself write. They say it's always better to have written than to actually write. People are proud when they write, but they hate it when they're actually doing it. So what I would recommend is that you check out this book called Writing Your Dissertation in 15 Minutes a Day. And basically it says you don't have to spend a ton of time, like hours at a time, on the dissertation in one setting. You can actually do it, break it into smaller, more manageable pieces and do it over a longer period of time. So Bolker, who wrote this book, talks about setting a daily writing goal. And she says every day, just plan to write about 5 pages, and that's it. And the great thing about this system is that it honors fast writing. So if you write your 5 pages in an hour, then you're done for the day. You can move on. You can watch your favorite television show. You can just do whatever you want to do. If it takes you longer, then you have to be committed to finishing your 5 pages in that day. But if you think about it, if you write 5 pages a day for 5 days, you have a chapter. So really, if you can force yourself to do it, it takes some self-discipline, which is in short supply. But if you can force yourself to do it, then you can actually produce a thesis in a short amount of time. Not every day is going to be perfect. Some days are going to be deserts in terms of writing. But if you're able to meet this goal you will be able to produce a significant amount of your thesis or dissertation or scholarly article. And I have to say it really works. And I think that it gets easier the more you do it. It's kind of like writing a thesis or a dissertation is kind of like running a marathon. You don't just start running the marathon willy-nilly. You actually build up to it, right? And this kind of helps you do that. I would also recommend setting up bi-monthly meetings with a tutor and kind of offset those with your thesis director or dissertation director. Or if you're writing a scholarly article or even a popular science article you're wanting to get published, if you have some editor, kind of set it up oppositionally. So basically, I'm producing, some text, and I'm having my tutor look over it to check it to make sure it kind of makes sense to someone who's a novice to this field. And then I take that product and I show it to my thesis director, and then he or she gives me better feedback that helps me change it in a bigger way and a more meaningful way, right? I think that's a really helpful system that I wish I would have done when I was in your position. And then I would recommend checking out all dates. A lot of dates are on the Graduate Studies website, so you can find when route sheets are due, when you have to defend, when you have to take the thesis or dissertation to get bound by the library. All of these things come at the end, so know what's required of your project ahead of time. And I think that if you apply some of these project management techniques, that your thesis will run a little bit more smoothly. Let's talk a little bit again about writing, and let's talk about audience, register, and tone. These three things will influence the way that you write. And the first is audience, so who will read my document. Register, which I'll get into, is basically how formal I should be when I write something. And tone, obviously, is my attitude as the writer toward, myself, for one, my subject, for another, and also my audience. How do I feel about my audience? Am I contemptuous of them? Am I trying to, make them feel better? Is this a public relations tool, right? So am I trying to get in their good graces? When we think about our audience, I think a lot of times as students, we just focus on the professor. That's who reads my stuff, that's who's giving me the grade, and that's the only person who matters. And yes, that's true in a practical sense. But also you guys are preparing yourselves to become, for a bigger career. And you need to start thinking about the wider audience. So this can include other scientists in your discipline, maybe interested non-scientists, the media, right? You have to really consider that. I went to this conference called the University Research Magazine Association Conference in Corvallis, Oregon last year, and I met a lot of science writers, and even some scientists came and spoke there, and they talked about how the great thing about what you do as scientists is that your work is very powerful, and it influences politics, it influences policy, it can positively change people's lives. But then when scientists are often interviewed in the media, partly because scientists aren't really prepared to talk to the media, and partly because the media, the way the media works, they take a story that they they don't understand all the details of, and then they get it out there. So scientists end up being unhappy with the way that they are presented in the media, and therefore reluctant to talk to the media. That's a bad thing, obviously, for the scientist, because that means your work isn't getting out there, and you're not having that really powerful positive effect on the world. So I think that kind of being aware of how you look on camera and how you sound when you talk, and really making sure to emphasize those details will be helpful. And also, I will say that the way that a lot of science is written, when I talk to a lot of the faculty, they say, well, we use this abstract register, and that's great. But about 2% of people in the world have master's degrees and 1% has a PhD. So if you think about it, if you're writing to that audience, you're writing to a very small audience. You're excluding huge segments of the world. And if you think about the general community, think about how many people don't believe in evolution. Think about how many people don't believe that humans are having an effect on the climate, right? I mean, there's a giant gap between scientists and lay society. And most people, they just aren't very literate in terms of science. So I think that if scientists are able to become better writers, better communicators, clearer in the way they convey information, they can actually help to improve a lot of that science illiteracy, in other words. So I would think about your audience, and of course this depends on what you're writing. You might choose to write a book, like a popular science book, where you're really trying to break something that's very complex down and talk to a broad audience, who might include people who have never studied science. documents. But if you are writing to another scientist in the academy, you're going to have to use that abstract register. You're going to have to sound a little bit, you're going to have to up your ante in terms of your vocabulary and write in this really dense way. Let's see. I think this is more of the same, really. I would just say that if you're unsure of your audience, err on the conservative side and try to be clearer. And obviously, when you're considering your audience, this will influence the way that you consider register and tone. So register is basically a continuum of formality. So here's where I'm really informal with my family and my best friends, and here's where I'm super, super formal. I'm speaking to the president, right? And it's like a continuum, and that's what register is. And there are different types of register. If you think about how people in the military sound, they have a very specific way of talking, of delivering sentences. If you think about when you write like a resume, you often delete I. Like you don't say, I interviewed people, I wrote a magazine. You say, wrote a magazine, interviewed people. There are these conventions to certain documents, right? So anyway, in terms of register, I just again wanted to emphasize the smallness of the academic community. You might be interested to know that most newspapers are written on a 7th grade reading level. That's so that they can reach most people. And also in 2013, some 7% of 25 to 29-year-olds completed a master's degree or higher. So really, again, your community is very, very small. And honestly, from what I have read, and again, this isn't the gospel, but that community might actually be getting smaller because of funding for higher education. People are kind of reluctant to take on student loans, and so more people aren't going to college, so that community is shrinking. I just wanted to show some different types of register. So informal register is, again, how formal you are with your family and friends, which isn't very much. It's conversation, it's emotional, it's conversational and emotional. It assumes a familiarity, and often you're telling a story. Here's an example, which was pulled from Writing Science in Plain English. So have you ever wondered how the heck do porcupines manage to mate with all those spines everywhere? Well, the answer to that question is pretty hard to figure out because porcupines are hard to see at the best of times. But it's almost impossible when they're courting. It turns out that the whole affair is up to the woman. When she's ready to become pregnant, she produces a strong odor that can drive the male porcupine crazy. So what makes this informal? What are some characteristics that you notice?
Like the word, like the egg and the crazy.
Right, exactly. So word choice, right? So heck is a word that you would never find in an academic article, right? You'd never see that. It's just too informal. What's something else you find other than word choice? I might point out punctuation. You don't often find a lot of exclamation marks in academic writing. That's a very emotional piece of punctuation, right? That's to be avoided at most times. But, when you write on Facebook, you might have like 5, exclamation points. Also, I might point to things like well. That's even though this could be considered word choice, that's not really. It's kind of like you're thinking, you're trying to come up with your answer. It's just very conversational, and it's a little bit less word choice. But the word for it's actually escaping me at this point. So that's here's, and also just the entire document's very accessible. Here's another example. There are degrees of informality. So this is, I think, an example of a letter from the National Science Foundation for Ocean Scientists, and it says, "Thank you for your interest in the National Science Foundation Ocean Sciences Research Experience for Undergraduates program. We expect about 80 applications for 9 fellowships, but don't let that put you off. All of life is like that, and you can't get it if you don't try. If you have a decent academic record and can write an intelligible and personalized statement of interest, you stand a good choice of success." So again, we see word choice that makes this really informal. We see punctuation. I would also point out that that they give kind of advice that's emotional, like all of life is like that, and you can't get it if you don't try. They're being very emotional with the reader. And they also use we. Oftentimes this isn't used in scientific writing. They use third person rather than first person, right? So those are some examples of informal register. Another is popular register. This is the type of writing you see in magazines like Nature, Wired, Scientific American. Again, you're telling a story. That's really important because people are storytelling creatures, and we are always, to understand something, we have to understand the story. It includes characters that readers can visualize, like porcupines or Schweitzer or whatever it is. The writing's still clear, and it's able to be easily understood, and there are a few technical terms. Here's an example. I won't, in the interest of time, I won't read it, but you're welcome to go back. Again, it's something like you might see in Nature or Wired or something of that genre. There's conventional register, which honestly is just like a tick above popular register. Actually, Neasley points out that this is one that's often employed in theses, but when I talked to Dr. Galliard, she said, no, we really use abstract register more. So basically, it's just slightly more formal, but it's still aimed at a broad scientific audience. So this is something that may be written in, let's say, a grant proposal, for example. It's more formal than the other two registers. It still tells a story. It still features active voice, so we'll look at the example in a minute. And you might use technical terms, but you're defining them because you're not trying to write jargon, right, which is inaccessible language. So here's an example of conventional register. I track the movement of North American porcupines in the Great Basin of northwestern Nevada. I related these movements to breeding activities during the late summer and fall of 1991 and 1992. Male porcupines are polygamous and defend several females, and I hypothesized that one, competitively dominant males would have larger home ranges than both subordinate males and adult females, and two, the size of home ranges of adult males would vary and be positively correlated with breeding success. So again, you see a lot of I tracked, and what else? I hypothesized. We're going to compare that to abstract register now. So abstract register is what most academic scientific writing is written in. Many scientists in various disciplines use third person when they're writing about writing theses, dissertations, or scholarly articles. This type of writing is dense and it's exclusive. It's inaccessible to many audiences. Active verbs become passive. So zombies ate her brains become her brains were eaten. Maybe by zombies, or maybe they leave that off because, again, that's optional. So the experiment was conducted, right? The main character of the conventional register I has disappeared, and verbs have been abstracted into nouns. So a verb like I tracked then becomes a noun, which is not the tracking, but rather the assessment, because the tracking would even be a little informal, right? You want something that's a little bit more impenetrable. The story element is completely gone. You're just relating information. It's more journalistic in that sense, right? And also some of the active voice. You might find active voice, that is true. Dr. Hugh Stam did mention that, again, you might be using we found, but you're just using passive voice a lot more. So here's an example of abstract register. So again, compare that to conventional register. The assessment of strong directional tendencies of the North American porcupine in the Great Basin of northwestern Nevada was made in relation to sex-specific behavioral heterogeneity during the late summer and fall periods of 1991 and 1992. A mate defense polygamous mating system was exhibited, and it was hypothesized that one, comparatively larger home ranges would be defended by competitively dominant males in comparison to the home ranges of subordinate males and females, and two, male home range size variation would be positively correlated with reproductive success. Now, most undergraduates reading a scholarly article written like this for the first time would be scared away, for one. They wouldn't understand what they're reading because it's inaccessible to them. They don't understand the genre. So that's one thing. Whenever you're going to write something that you've never written before, like a thesis, I would say read a lot of theses so that you get an idea of what they sound like and you're familiar with the genre. But also, again, the story element is gone, and that's really what helps us to understand how that works. So I'll talk a little bit about tone now. I'm running a little bit out of time. But again, it's your attitude toward yourself as a writer, toward your subject and your audience. It can range from arrogant to dismissive, from timid to confident, from energetic to dull, from cynical to optimistic. Again, in science writing, we maintain a neutral tone. and we're primarily informing an audience. But again, you are persuading people to a degree, so you'll want to be confident, and this is especially true in a proposal, where self-assurance and enthusiasm are crucial. So what I did was I took from, I think, Writing Science in Plain English, I took 2 examples, and I want you to tell me which example sounds more confident. So the first one says, horned beetles could provide an opportunity to combine studies of trait development with experiences looking at sexual selection and the evolutionary significance of enlarged male weapons, that is, horns. After almost 10 years of research, the PI may now have the opportunity, if funded, to piece together disparate parts of the research program, offering opportunities to train young scientists and possibly providing a picture of the evolution of unusual animal shapes. All right, so keep that in mind as we look at this next one, which is written almost the same. Horned beetles provide an unusual opportunity to combine studies of trait development with experiments exploring sexual selection and the evolutionary significance of enlarged male weapons, again, that is, horns. By building on almost 10 years of research directed toward this goal, the PI now has the opportunity to forge a truly integrative research program offering unique possibilities for inspiring and training young scientists and providing a comprehensive picture of the evolution of some of nature's most bizarre animal shapes. So which of these 2 examples, and I can flip back and forth between if you need, which of these 2 examples sounds more confident? This one or this one? The second one? What makes the second one sound more confident?
Make statements rather than questions.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Sure. So I think the first sentence of the first one said something like horned beetles may provide or could provide.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like they're not sure if it will or won't. Whereas the second one says it will provide it. Horned beetles provide.
Right.
So they're stating that this is what's going to happen versus kind of waffling between if it will or won't.
Very good. So obviously be very careful in how you choose language like could, things like that. This is called hedging language, where you're trying to, well, it may, you're trying to be careful. And in some documents, you will want to be careful. You won't want to say, this is the way it is and there's no other way. But if you're trying to get money from some organization, you want to be pretty positive, and you want to say that you can actually deliver on your promise to them. So that's a very good thing. What else does it do? How else does it sound confident?
There's not as much negativity in the second one. So in the first one, it talks about piecing together disparate parts.
Mm-hmm.
In the second one, it's much more positive to forge a truly integrative research program.
Yeah, very good. And build on almost 10 years of research. Also, just the word, that's excellent. Also, just the word choice, an unusual opportunity, meaning this is not one that comes around very often. And also a unique opportunity, right? Like, this is very special. This isn't going to happen all the time. So you should, pay me to do this. All right, the last couple of slides in the remaining time, I'll have some time to answer questions if you have broad questions. But some things that I'd just like to tell you about are kind of my own experience. I had planned on going and getting a PhD, and I still might, but right now I have my master's degree. And after I got my master's degree, I kind of felt burnt out because I realized that I had been in school since the age of 4, just continuously. And I actually wanted to do something because I feel like the great thing about the university is that it's a place where ideas are exchanged, and that's wonderful. But I also wanted to kind of get my hands dirty and actually do things. And also, to be quite frank, in the humanities, it's kind of a bad idea to get a PhD in them sometimes because it's not guaranteed that you're going to get tenure. And even if you are in a different position, you realize that when you get your PhD, that you're going to move someplace and you're going to work uphill like really hard to get tenure, and it's not guaranteed that you will, and you might spend 4 or 5 years of your life at a place, and if you don't get tenure, then you have to move on and start all over again. So what I would say is that in terms of your career, keep your options open. Have a plan A, B, C, D. And some things that you might consider are how you can take what you have already and apply it in a really creative way. You're probably familiar with logical fallacies, and one of the logical fallacies is the false dilemma, the either-or dilemma. So it says it's either this way or it's that way. I either get a PhD or I don't get a PhD, and life is awful, right? But that's not true. That's a false dilemma. There could be a third option, a more creative option, right? So you're not just faced with two options in life. So I would say, first of all, diversify. Even if you want to stay in academia, it's important that you're able to have a lot of skills. Even in my current job, where I'm mainly a writer, it's important that I know things about Excel, so certain types of software. It's important that I can also publicly speak. It's important that I have a broad range of talents. And if you think about it, think about all the things like in the 90s. You had a watch, you had a compass, you had a map, right? You had a telephone. But nowadays, you have a phone where all that stuff is condensed. And that's kind of how you are too, as an employee, as a person, as a citizen. All of those things that were specialized before, where you had one person who did the writing, one person who did the researching, all of that's kind of you. You are the new iPhone in a way. So I would say diversify, be curious, seek out different opportunities. And you are obviously doing that. A lot of you are scientists and you're interested in becoming better writers. And that can help you do different things. Like for instance, you might go into science journalism. When I went to that conference, I met a lot of people who had gotten bachelor's of science and also master's degrees in things like fish ecology, and then they went on to become photojournalists, and they sell their work to Nature and different programs, and they go all over the world documenting animals. And I thought, what a cool job! Like, that's a great thing to do. You could also write in journalism. I mean, journalism's a very broad field, and you could kind of carve out your own niche. You could go into the private sector and write sales material, marketing, things like that. If you're interested in writing an article, like a science-based article, and pitching it, a lot of it is written on spec, which means that you do it on your own time without getting paid, and then you try to sell it. So what I would say is read the publication you're interested in getting involved with. If I want to write an article for Texas Monthly, I better be reading Texas Monthly and have a really good idea of how that publication is set up. And maybe there are different sections, and maybe I'm going to focus on one section. I'm going to identify who edits that section, and then I'm going to pitch my story to that person. I'm going to figure out how my story works best. Is it news? Is it a feature? Remember, news is just information, right? Whereas a feature is more of a story, and it focuses on one person generally. Maybe it's a blog. Maybe you're interested in doing a podcast. I love podcasts. Maybe you listen to them too. There's a great one, Science Times, which actually ended recently, but also Radio Lab is really cool, and so maybe you just have an interest in that and you want to talk about topics that you find fascinating. Again, identify who edits it, and then email the top line of your story. That's like the first line, the hook of the article that you want to pitch, and maybe 100 words of context of what the article's about. Another option is just to email the entire article. There are some worries when you write on spec of, are they going to just take my ideas and have someone they're already paying use them, which that's possible. But in general, people tend to be pretty honorable when it comes to this, and you might not hear anything back. So one thing I would say is brace yourself for rejection, and don't be worried by it. Some writers have been rejected hundreds of times before they had their big break. So you'll kind of just need to you'll need to brace yourself for that, but also you could have a big breakthrough. And also, don't wait when you send something to an editor. Follow up with them maybe a week later and just send them an email and say, hey, I don't know if you got this. But don't just wait for them, because you might not ever hear anything back in that sense. And people do appreciate when people follow up. The other thing I would say is reach out to the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, and also the Office of Marketing and Communications. I found that people on this campus are very willing to help you, and a lot of these people deal with the media all the time. So they might have connections that you could use. They might have good advice for you. They might be willing to read your article before it gets published in Nature, for example, and help you to get it published. They also have a list of like all different types of people around here who publish, and their own connections, so they might be willing to help you. The very last thing, which I think you'll find useful, is what readers are looking for when they read unfamiliar text. So if you're going to write for a broad audience, you need to, one, tell a story about characters. So porcupines are doing stuff, not the assessment, right? The assessment was hypothesized. Don't write like that. So again, many species have disappeared in the past 10 years. Write strong active verbs. So a strong active verb is like accumulated, hypothesized. It's not something like a version of the verb to be or to have. Those are considered weak verbs. They just talk about existence. That's not much of an action. Also, you'll want to make sure that your subject, like we, and your verb accumulated are really close together. Don't split those apart because that just allows people to get confused and lose track. Also, old information tends to be at the beginning of a sentence and new information is at the end. So when I was in a linguistics class, I remember this example, which was if you went into a garage and you didn't expect a snake to be there and there's this poisonous snake, you probably wouldn't run out and be like, a snake is in the garage. That just sounds kind of false. It sounds kind of fake in English. And the reason why is because new information comes at the end of sentences because that's the last thing that we hear. So that's the last thing that we're going to remember. So normally if you are surprised by a snake in the garage, you're going to say, there's a snake in the garage. And you actually have this dummy subject there inserted. There doesn't mean anything. It doesn't stand for anything. It's the same way in it rained. It doesn't refer to anything. We just have to have a subject in English. There's very rigid word order in English, and you have to do that. It's not true of every language, but it's true of English. So kind of think about that. Think about, when you're getting ready to introduce new information, make sure that it's coming at the end of a sentence. And I would also say that there are ways like you can pace your language. So when you write shorter sentences, that forces people to slow down. When you write longer sentences, they can speed up when they read. So if you're wanting people to focus, write shorter sentences, shorter, choppier sentences. If everything's choppy, then it's going to be monotone. If everything's really long, it's going to get too complex and they're going to get lost. So think about varying your sentence length and also the way that you're presenting information in sentences. And finally, be aware of where people are expecting information. They say that when you take the GRE, that a GRE reader reads your essay for about 2 minutes. They're not spending a lot of time on it. They're looking for information where they expect it to be, and if they don't see it, they don't care. They're going to give you a lower grade. So make sure that you're following IMRD, that you have a thesis statement, and that you have transitions through the essay. So I think that that's all my time. If you have questions, you're willing to stay after, and I can talk to you about that. Also, be sure to fill out that survey if you don't mind so that I can have some feedback, and I appreciate all of you coming.